Cheese is one of the oldest foods on Earth, older than written history, older than most religions, even older than the wheel. For thousands of years, it tasted the way bacteria, thyme, and one particular patch of grass decided it should taste. That cheese, the one your great-grandparents might have eaten, barely exists anymore. Not because the recipes changed. The names on the label are often identical: Brie, Camembert, Cheddar, Parmesan. But somewhere over the last 100 years, a quiet collision between public health law, industrial chemistry, and global supply chains rewrote almost everything about how that cheese is made, and, more importantly, how it actually tastes. Americans now eat more cheese than at any point in history, nearly 40 pounds per person every year according to USDA data. Almost none of us have ever tasted the cheese this country's traditions were originally built on. Today, we're going to show you exactly what happened, and why the cheese sitting in your refrigerator right now is, in a very real sense, a different food than the one its name promises. To understand what changed, you first have to understand what raw milk actually is. It is not a sterile liquid, it's a living ecosystem. Fresh, unpasteurized milk is full of bacteria, not just one or two strains, but hundreds of distinct species, unique to the particular farm, the particular herd, even the particular season. These bacteria, along with naturally occurring enzymes like lipases and proteases, don't just sit there once the milk becomes cheese. They keep working for weeks, months, sometimes years, slowly breaking down fats and proteins into the hundreds of flavor compounds that give aged cheese its complexity: nutty, grassy, mushroomy, and what cheesemakers affectionately call barnyard notes. In 2014, microbiologist Rachel Dutton and food scientist Benjamin Wolfe published a study in the journal Cell mapping the bacterial and fungal communities living on cheese rinds. What they found was striking. Cheese rinds host some of the most diverse, tractable microbial communities ever studied in a food product. Entire miniature ecosystems, different from one wheel to the next, shaped by the raw milk and the cave or cellar they aged in. A single raw milk wheel can carry dozens of distinct bacterial and fungal species working together. A standard commercial starter culture, by contrast, is usually built from just 2 or 3 specific strains, selected for predictable, repeatable performance rather than complexity. That diversity is, quite literally, where traditional cheese flavor came from. Pasteurization wasn't invented for cheese, or even for milk. Louis Pasteur developed the heat treatment process in the 1860s to stop wine and beer from spoiling. It took decades before anyone applied it seriously to dairy, but by the early 1900s, American cities had a genuine public health crisis. Raw milk, shipped long distances under unsanitary conditions, was a major source of tuberculosis, typhoid fever, and infant mortality. Chicago became the first major U.S. city to require pasteurized milk for sale within its limits in 1908. Other cities followed over the following decades, and by the 1940s, pasteurization had become the standard for nearly all fluid milk sold in the United States. This was, unambiguously, a public health triumph. Pasteurization saved an enormous number of lives, full stop. But it came with a side effect almost nobody was thinking about at the time. Heating milk to pasteurization temperatures doesn't just kill dangerous bacteria, it kills essentially everything: the beneficial bacteria, the wild yeast, and it deactivates many of the natural enzymes that, over weeks of aging, build the deep flavor of a real cheese. The bacteria responsible for milk's disease risk were, in many cases, the very same ones building its flavor. For cheese specifically, the United States didn't ban raw milk outright. Instead, in 1949, the FDA settled on something more surgical, a rule stating that any cheese made from unpasteurized milk must be aged for a minimum of 60 days, at a temperature no lower than 35 degrees Fahrenheit, before it can be sold. The logic, based on research available at the time, was that 60 days of aging would allow dangerous pathogens like Salmonella and Listeria to die off naturally inside the cheese, even without pasteurization. It's a reasonable-sounding compromise. But food scientists have pointed out a major flaw for decades: that research was largely conducted on hard, low-moisture cheeses like cheddar. Soft, high-moisture cheeses, Brie, Camembert, fresh chèvre, behave very differently. Pathogens don't necessarily die off the same way in a soft, moist, low-acid environment. A rule built for one category of cheese was applied across all of them. The practical result is this: virtually every Brie, Camembert, or soft ripened cheese made and sold in the United States today, is made from pasteurized milk, by legal necessity, because almost none of them are aged 60 days. Meanwhile, in France, authentic Camembert de Normandie and traditional Brie de Meaux are protected under appellation law that specifically requires raw milk, because French regulators concluded pasteurization destroys the cheese's defining character. Same name. Two opposite legal philosophies, two genuinely different foods. Once you pasteurize milk, you've killed off its native bacteria, the wild farm-specific cultures that used to drive fermentation and flavor on their own. So cheesemakers have to add bacteria back, deliberately, in a controlled, standardized form. That bacteria no longer comes from the farm. It comes from a handful of global biotechnology suppliers, companies like Tripser Hansen in Denmark and IFF, formerly DuPont, that grow and freeze-dry specific bacterial strains, then sell them to cheesemakers around the world. A creamery in Wisconsin and a creamery in Australia may be starting their cheese with nearly identical commercial cultures, purchased from the very same handful of suppliers. The same industrial logic reached an even more fundamental ingredient: rennet, the enzyme that curdles milk into curds and whey. Traditional rennet comes from the stomach lining of young calves. In 1990, the FDA approved the first fermentation-produced chymosin, an enzyme functionally identical to animal rennet, but manufactured by genetically engineered microorganisms inside a bioreactor instead of extracted from an animal. Today, industry estimates suggest the large majority of cheese made in the United States uses this lab-grown rennet, rather than the animal-derived version. None of this is secretive, and fermentation-produced rennet is widely considered safe. It also made cheese accessible to vegetarians for the first time. But it's another layer of the same pattern. A food once shaped entirely by whatever was locally and biologically available is now shaped by a small number of standardized industrial inputs, used identically everywhere on Earth. There's one more piece of this that almost nobody talks about: the milk itself, before it ever becomes cheese. Traditionally, what a cow ate changed the milk, and therefore changed the cheese. Fresh spring grass produces milk with a different fat composition and different flavor precursors than dry winter hay. That's why European cheesemakers historically distinguished between a spring wheel and a winter wheel of the same cheese. The flavor genuinely shifted with the seasons. Large-scale dairy processors don't operate that way. Milk from hundreds of different farms, gathered by trucks circulating across an entire region, gets pooled together in massive holding tanks. Fat and protein levels are then standardized, often using membrane filtration technology, so that every batch entering the cheese vat has nearly identical composition, regardless of the season or which specific herd it came from. The business logic makes complete sense. Consistency. A retailer wants the cheddar they buy in March to taste exactly like the cheddar they buy in October, but that consistency is the opposite of what historically built a cheese's identity. Seasonal variation, farm-specific variation, herd-specific variation, all of it gets engineered out before the milk even reaches the vat. This is also in part a story about scale. According to USDA data, the number of dairy farms in the United States has fallen from several 100,000 in the mid-20th century to roughly 25,000 today, even as total milk production has climbed. Fewer, larger operations supplying enormous, centralized cheese plants is precisely the kind of system that rewards uniform milk and punishes the small, unpredictable variation that used to be the entire point. This isn't just a romantic argument about the good old days. It shows up in actual laboratory measurements. Food scientists comparing raw milk cheeses to pasteurized versions of the same style have repeatedly found a wider range and a greater total quantity of volatile flavor compounds, the specific molecules responsible for aroma and taste complexity. In blind sensory panels, pasteurized cheeses are consistently described using words like milder, flatter, and rounder, while raw milk versions of the same style draw out words like complex, nutty, grassy, and yes, sometimes funky. The industry's response to this gap has been quietly resourceful. Since pasteurization deactivates many of the natural enzymes responsible for flavor development, some manufacturers, particularly in lower-cost Italian-style hard cheeses, add back purified enzyme powders, like exogenous lipases, directly into the curd. The goal is to chemically recreate, in a matter of weeks, some of the sharp, piquant flavor notes that raw milk and many months of natural aging would have built on their own. Some of the specific compounds at stake have names that sound more like chemistry class than dinner. Diacetyl, which contributes a buttery note. Free fatty acids like butyric and caproic acid, responsible for sharp, tangy flavors in aged cheeses. And dozens of sulfur compounds that build the pungency in styles like aged cheddar or washed rind cheeses. Raw milk's native enzymes and bacteria generate these compounds gradually and unpredictably over time. Pasteurization removed the biological system that built complex cheese flavor. Industrial enzyme additives are, in some cases, a direct attempt to engineer that same flavor back in, just faster and from a bottle. This tension hasn't gone away. It's still actively being fought over, right now, on 2 continents. In the United States, the FDA has periodically considered tightening restrictions on raw milk cheese even further, citing food safety concerns. In 2014, the agency raised alarms about the centuries-old practice of aging cheese on wooden boards, suggesting the wood itself might harbor harmful bacteria, a move that triggered an immediate backlash from artisan cheesemakers, who pointed out that wood has been used safely for this purpose across Europe for generations. The FDA later clarified it wasn't issuing an outright ban, but the episode revealed how easily traditional methods can collide with modern regulatory caution. Artisan cheesemakers, represented by groups like the American Cheese Society, have pushed back hard on these recurring proposals, arguing that the original 1949 science behind the 60-day rule is outdated, and that modern raw milk cheesemaking, done with proper controls, carries a manageable risk relative to the flavor it preserves. Meanwhile, across much of Europe, the relationship between raw milk and law runs in the exact opposite direction. Protected designation of origin rules for cheeses like Comté, Parmigiano Reggiano, and Roquefort don't just permit raw milk, they require it. Pasteurizing the milk used for these cheeses would strip them of their legally protected name, because European regulators concluded the opposite of what American regulators concluded. Pasteurization doesn't just reduce risk, it erases the product's authentic identity. Same starting ingredient, broadly similar process, 2 governments, 2 opposite philosophies, and 2 genuinely different cheeses sharing strikingly similar names. So, where does that leave you the next time you're standing at a cheese counter? If you want to taste something closer to cheese's traditional form, look specifically for the words raw milk or late cru on the label, and remember that under U.S. law, that almost always means the cheese has been aged at least 60 days, which rules out fresh, soft styles entirely. Imported European cheeses carrying AOC or PDO certification are often your most reliable legal access point to authentic raw milk versions of classic styles. If you're buying pasteurized cheese, which describes most of what's available, and there's genuinely nothing wrong with that, understand that what you're tasting is a careful, engineered approximation of a flavor system that, for most of human history, simply happened on its own. And if you ever see something labeled pasteurized processed cheese, know that you're in an entirely different category altogether, one dating back to a patent filed by James L. Kraft in 1916, designed purely for shelf stability and consistent melting, with flavor never the point at all. Cheese isn't fake, and it isn't dangerous. But the cheese most Americans eat today is the product of a century of safety regulation and industrial engineering, layered quietly on top of something that used to simply be alive. If this changed how you'll look at a cheese label next time you're at the store, hit like. It genuinely helps this kind of research reach more people. And tell me in the comments, have you ever actually tasted real raw milk cheese, and did it taste different to you?